The Archetype of Sacrifice and the Regulation of Archetypal Energies is a series of 2 lecture workshops delivered by Dr. Robert Moore in May 2003. Dr. Moore goes deep into the plumbing of the masculine psyche and the 4 elements we all have within us, which influence our behavior and personality traits. In the second part of the workshop, Dr. Moore goes over how you can start to balance these forces within you to become a more powerful, creative, and radiant man.
Well, welcome to our second day. As living proof that it's hard to do away with your own grandiose energies, I had all you introduce yourselves yesterday, and I just assumed you would know who I was. And that was my own grandiosity, because I'm sure some of you don't know me from Adam. I'm Robert Moore. I wear quite a few hats these days in my continued grandiosity-fueled workaholism, which I continue to try to compensate for by getting more conscious. But anyway, I'm a professor of psychoanalysis, culture, and spirituality at the Chicago Theological Seminary in Hyde Park. It's the oldest graduate school in this metropolitan area on the campus of the University of Chicago, across the street from the Oriental Institute. A lot of great institutions down there. I also am the co-founder with Dr. Margaret Shanahan of the Institute for Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Spirituality, and of its training, research and training arm, the Institute for the Science of Psychoanalysis. We are trying to push psychoanalytic conversations toward the challenge of facing that we have a scientific task, that psychoanalysis shouldn't be a multitude of tribal cults which foster hate and misunderstanding of each other, that we all carry a part of the psychoanalytic song line. We all have something to offer each other. And so we're seeking to facilitate the kind of high-level dialogue in our various enterprises, interdisciplinary dialogues between psychology and spirituality, and dialogues between different psychoanalytic schools of thought toward the end of having a more adequate scientific approach, interdisciplinary, based on interdisciplinary research, for the progress of contemporary psychoanalysis and future psychoanalysis. It's consistent with the National Association for Psychoanalysis, what we call NAP, and I'm also, and have been for many years, as some of you know, on the faculty of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. I have studied in depth many of these different schools of psychoanalytic thought. I hold a diploma from the Adler Institute. My first book was a Freudian book. My wife and I both have studied at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute rather extensively in their programs, and we've studied at the Freudian Institute in Quebec City, Canada. And I like to say to my friends, I've had more psychotherapy with more different schools of thought than I want to remember. They all help me, but there's still a long way to go, as we've learned in this workshop. It's always a joy to teach at this institute and to talk about these things which are of so much importance to all of us. And again, I deeply appreciate your coming and giving me an opportunity to think out loud about these issues. I'll say more maybe after our break about some of the advanced seminars that I intend to continue offering here in Chicago and on the East and West Coast in my own school of thought, which, as you undoubtedly can get some sense of, which I draw from all of these different schools of psychoanalysis, I'm a Neo-Jungian, but somebody could make the case that I'm a Neo-Adlerian, that I'm a Neo-Freudian, that I have tried to draw on a vast variety of materials to come up with a more scientific psychoanalysis, which I call structural psychoanalysis, because any psychoanalysis that is scientific not only has to discern structures in the psyche, but it's got to have the best possible, it's got to try to develop the best possible understanding of how those structures got there, what goes wrong with them, and how dysfunctions of structure create psychopathology, and how changing structures aid us in helping the personality integrate and move more toward its optimum. So that's what my capital P project is. It's very grandiose, but I've always said, befriend your grandiosity. And who was it, Dizzy Dean, that said, it ain't grandiose if you can do it. So we'll see. The verdict, maybe when I'm 80, if I get to live to be 80, we'll see. So we'll see how grandiose it really was. I propose to speak from now till about 11, or maybe 10:45, depending on how we're feeling. On the first part of this outline here, today we're going to focus on the role of we're going to focus on this topic, the archetype of sacrifice and the dynamics of psychological and spiritual healing. We're going to focus more, not so much on the phenomenology of the archetype, but to highlight why this is important. Is this just some, Jungians like to study all these old things? It's just a Jungian thing. I don't for a minute believe that it's just a Jungian thing. I believe that there are fundamental scientific, structural reasons why looking at this archetypal pattern is important if you're going to develop a scientific psychoanalysis, for God's sake. And I'm going to talk about that today. So I'm going to begin this by talking about theories of change and why they matter in integrative psychotherapy, or for that matter, in a scientific psychoanalysis, a scientific theory of personality. But also, for those of you that are not practicing therapists in this audience, I'll talk about its role in integrative psychotherapy, analysis, if you're in analysis, and spiritual direction. You're all involved in trying to deal with spirituality, whether you're a professional in that field or not. If you're a businessman, I'm very interested in spirituality in business. One other thing I do in order to fill out my time is I have an international consulting practice and consult with people, business leaders and people in government and so on, and not-for-profit institutions. So there's a spirituality of business, there's a spirituality of leadership, and the plumbing that I'm talking about this weekend is important for anybody that's doing any of those things. It's the heart of where we live. And then I'm going to talk about, Edward Edinger, the one man I admire a great deal, claimed Jungian psychology is a new dispensation, and he was talking about that in the context of these different religious phenomena. And he was suggesting that there was some radical thing about Jung's insights that created a new situation with regard to understanding the challenge of spirituality. And I'm going to tell you why I think I've decided that he's right about that there is a decisive thing going on here, and I just want to try to get clear about what that is instead of making it mystified and fuzzy. And so I'm going to focus on the difference in a Jungian and Neo-Jungian, which is what I would talk about as my theory, in complex theory, because so many different schools of psychotherapy have theories of the complex. But it's very important to understand the difference between personal complexes, which are grounded for the most part, for example, in some personal trauma, and the transpersonal aspect of those complexes. I will be talking about complexes which I'm going to try to get you to do something more serious with the archetypal core of complexes. Jungians will say to you, classical Jungians will say, at the core of every complex there's an archetypal element. But they don't really talk very systematically about that, and they don't really help you kind of get specific, which is what I've been trying to do. And so I'm going to talk about two different kinds of transpersonal dimensions to your complexes. One has to do with the archetypal self-potentials that I've been talking about in the quadrants, the four elements of the psyche as I believe them to be, that create problems until you get them regulated. That is one specific kind of autonomous complex grounded in transpersonal energies. Then there's another kind, which I will just mention and talk about a little bit, is what Jung called the spirit complex. These are archetypal energies or forces or presences which are not self-potentials. They are other things, and they can get into the self system at times of vulnerability and so on. We'll talk about that. Remind me to make that clear to you. Then I'm going to focus on the archetype of sacrifice, its role in a structural cure. In other words, I'm going to talk to you about why you need to get this really clear in your mind if you're going to understand. I promised you we'd talk about the archetype of sacrifice and its role in regulating archetypal energies. And I'll be talking about why I believe that you have to think about this sacrificial process if you're going to understand the challenge of regulating the flooding of your archetypal energies. And I'll talk about the elements of that. We'll see how far we get on this before our break. And then we will address this alchemical image that I told you about yesterday that we're going to refer to, and I'm going to take you through that paradigmatic image from Jung's alchemical studies and just go over with you how that, I believe, summarizes what I've been trying to develop in my approach to this topic today. So that's my plan. Let me just ask you, is there any question or about that before we get started that you want to raise? I'm sure I confused you adequately yesterday. Well, we'll jump in then. Let me start. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but because I've spoken about it a lot of places. Right now I've started teaching a new course in my graduate school called Theories of Change and Personal and Social Transformation, in which we look at comparatively and phenomenological theories of change, psychoanalytic theories of change, systems theories of change, prophetic theories of change in various religious traditions, including liberation theology and etc. Tillich's theory of change, that is philosophical, theological theories of change, to help people understand the importance of getting clear about what your theory of change is. Because people have an idea, well, we're just going to go out here and we're just going to transform the world. We're going to transform these personalities. We're going to transform the world. Well, that's great, and that's what we want to do. But when you study in depth comparative theories of change, which I've tried to do for a long time, you realize that theories are really different, and theories matter, because theories, depending on what you think about how change occurs, it will influence what you do. Your actual theory of change may be different from what you think your theory of change is, and that's another issue. But we just have to try to get conscious today about, say, I take theory seriously. It matters how you think the personality operates. So it's like the plumbing. What's the plumbing? How does it work? And so the different theories have very different approaches to change. And let me just give you the postage stamp version of this. And hopefully I'll get a chance. Maybe I'll try to eventually get some more of this stuff published. But in any case, say we take a Freudian theory of change. Freudian theory of change assumes that the primal forces of the id are pressing on individuals from within, the it. And it is so powerful, and it is so unpleasant, so grandiose in its demands, that the ego has terrible struggle with it. The ego is caught between the press of the it for total gratification and the restrictions of culture and civilization. And so the ego has to engage in all sorts of strategies to try to keep not only the culture from knowing what the it is up to, but also the individual, to keep the individual from knowing what the wish is. So in that theory, in a classical Freudian theory of change, there's many Freudianisms as there are different brands of weeds, but the classic Freudian position is that you have to get beneath the trickster mechanisms of the ego to see clearly what the primal wish is. That's the first thing you've got to do. Then you've got to help the individual come to compromises between the pressures of the it and the limits of civilization. So in a classical Freudian theory of change, you have to come to compromise formations in the personality so you can get as much of the wish fulfilled as you can without getting arrested or killed. And so the analyst, the classical Freudian analyst is working on that basis to help the person gradually come to a knowing of their wish. And through the analytical relationship, to be able to be more, I would like to say, to be fair to the Freudians, to be more compassionate about the wishes. Not that you act them out, in raw form, but that you try to get the wishes someplace in the world. And that's a classical Freudian theory of change. An Adlerian theory of change is very different. In an Adlerian theory of change, you understand that persons come into the world. When an individual comes in the world, an Adlerian is what we could call a phenomenological psychologist. We could call him a subjective behaviorist in some ways. They're the primal foundation of cognitive psychotherapy and cognitive psychology. And so an Adlerian will say that individual comes into the world, as they develop their perceptual capacities, they perceive the world in a certain structured way. There is a structure to their perception. And it's based on their experience, their own individual experience, and their extrapolations, sort of their logical extrapolations from their experience in the family constellation and in their position, the view from their position in the birth order in the early years of life. And that perceptual paradigm that individual develops hardens into what an Adlerian calls the lifestyle. And it is the dominant, we would say, psychological structure in the individual personality. Usually, you have to understand this structure if you're going to understand the particular form the superiority complex takes in that personality, and the particular form the inferiority complex takes in that particular personality. And so for an Adlerian, the theory of change is this person is thinking badly. It's not that they're not logical. They are operating very logically. What is the problem? The problem is what they would know in economics. You talk about it as the sample that they made their assumptions based on is too small. So in other words, they set up their global worldview based on a very, very specific set of circumstances, and then they generalized that worldview from those early experiences. And so, if I'm an Adlerian analyst, what I have to do is I have to help that person understand the idiosyncrasy, the specificity, the uniqueness of their particular perceptual style, their own subjective, the structure of their subjectivity. And if I can help that individual see the structure of their subjectivity, why it got that way, help them understand it, therefore transcend it conceptually, transcend it in terms of their understanding, then I, the Adlerian analyst, and the analysand can work together to alter those assumptions which I am operating out of so that they conform more adequately to the larger reality. You follow me? You see that? So that's why we would say an Adlerian is a cognitive psychotherapist. They're also, though, a behavioral therapist because they understand that particular perceptual frameworks issue in certain types of behavior. And they also know that it's not very easy to change your perceptual framework if you don't change your behavior. So, as one of the great, there are two really outstanding Adlerian teachers that I was privileged to have. One was Bernard Schulman, and the other one was Harold Mozak. And Harold Mozak, I believe, used to say that it's a lot easier to behave your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of behaving. And so, by golly, there's a sense in which that's the way I'm Neo-Adlerian, because I really believe that's true. That there have to be enactments, ritual enactments, to help people transform their misaligned perception. So in any case, that is the Adlerian theory of change. And so for an Adlerian, you have a certain set of early memories, but when your perception is restructured based on a more adequate understanding of the world, more adequate mention-kentness, more adequate understanding of the human, then your memories will change. Even your memories will change. Now, a Jungian theory of change, a classical Jungian theory of change, the autonomous complex is causing you problems because it's an organization in your personality that's causing you to do things that you do not understand. You've got to come to a more clear awareness of what this complex is. And your ego consciousness has got to scan for the complex. It's got to find the key complexes. It's got to understand them. It's got to become more aware of all of the archetypal and personal material that is organized together in that complex. And your challenge is to become a more integrated person so that your ego consciousness is on better terms with all of your complexes. It's almost like diplomatic relations between you and your complexes. You send out your ambassadors, try to get them into talks. And you can see Gene Boland's work on this, Gods in Every Man, Goddesses in Every Woman. If you haven't looked at that, look at that. It's a fine kind of classical Jungian take. Has certain parallels to my work. In any case, so if a Jungian is going to, classical Jungian is going to work with you, they're going to be looking for what can we do to find out what these complexes are. First, well, the word association test was one of the early techniques. And then this is why Jungians emphasize dream interpretation. Because there are a lot of people that look at dreams. You don't have to be a Jungian to look at dreams. Just because somebody studies dreams, that doesn't make them Jungian. What a Jungian is doing in their theory of change, when they look at dreams, they're looking for the clues to what the complexes are, what the autonomous complexes are. Because the Jungian assumption is that the ego really doesn't know too much about what the autonomous complexes are. So I could sit and talk to you for ages. I could work with you in analysis for years. And expecting your ego to be able to tell me what your complexes are, and your problem is precisely that you don't know what they are. If you knew what they are, you would already be working on them. So a Jungian is going to talk to you and try to do everything they can to help you in talking to your ego. But the classical Jungian is really interested in what your dream says, and also in what you learn through active imagination, techniques in which you start trying to dialogue with your anima or your animus. You dialogue with the wise person within. You write these dialogues in journals. So journaling for a Jungian is vastly different from journaling for somebody that's not a Jungian. Because somebody who is a Jungian is going to be looking for what the autonomous complexes are that come up in that journaling process. Not just, the inner talk about stuff that you already know. So the theory of change for classical Jungian is we gotta locate the autonomous complexes. Then we've got to start working to overcome the alienation between the ego system and the autonomous complex, so that the autonomous complex doesn't keep you draining so much of your energy and creating so much chaos and disruption. That's their theory of change. Behavioral theory of change, behavioral therapy, they are going to be very symptom-oriented. You're going to look at what your symptoms are, and a behavioral therapist is going to assume that your symptoms have been learned. And there's a whole history of how they got learned, but they have been learned. And the behavioral therapist will make a contract with you to provide their skills in a sort of an approach to retraining you. And they will help you develop a behavioral program which, based on research about learning and behavior modification, they will help you engage in a series of carefully planned behaviors which will have the purpose of strengthening more adaptive behaviors, more creative and adaptive behaviors, and extinguishing the more dysfunctional ones. And so their theory of change is a theory of change about systematic learning based on the principles which have been established through the scientific study of learning processes, perceptual processes and learning processes. Cognitive therapists, we've already talked about Adler. Adler is a cognitive therapist, and the people like Beck and his descendants, and also Albert Ellis and the so-called rational emotive therapists, they are all crypto-Adlerians. And so we've already talked about a cognitive therapist. So-called dynamic therapist, by which we usually are referring to neo-Freudians of various camps who assume that unconscious processes are very important for personality functioning. Usually their focus is on personal experiences that the individual that has had and is either incapable of repressing or is repressing in such a way that it creates a very costly, dysfunctional aspect in their experience and behavior. But the focus is on what you and I would call the personal unconscious. And they use various techniques based in focusing on the transference and countertransference, focusing on personal developmental histories to get a sense of the trajectory of your development of your ego function. These are the ego psychologists, fundamentally the ego psychologists of whatever school. And they do they put a tremendous amount of emphasis on helping individuals move from infantile modes of interpersonal relationships. They talk about it in various ways, but toward more mature modes. This would include all of the object relations theorists as well. In terms of the immature personality tends to split into good and bad too much, and a dynamic psychotherapist will help an individual try to become more realistic, able to tolerate more ambiguity and more gray without fragmenting. And so that is a talking approach. And you can be in dynamic psychotherapy a long, long time talking about this. And they are extremely sophisticated in talking about the talking therapy. I mean, there's an enormous literature. Depth psychology is another appellation not used as widely. It sometimes can refer to a myriad of things. Sometimes people will use it to speak of Jungian psychotherapy, but they also apply it to logotherapy, or they apply it to existential analysis, psychotherapy and analysis. It is very similar to dynamic psychotherapy. And the depth issue is simply another code for we take unconscious processes seriously, right? Then there's the systems therapy approach, and there are a variety of these, but this is very influential in couples therapy and family therapy, and there have been some psychotherapists and depth and theoreticians such as Harry Stack Sullivan, the great Harry Stack Sullivan, who had a systems understanding of the system self. And again, I'm a neo-Sullivanian in the sense that I, unlike classical Jungians, put a lot of emphasis on the system self, not just the archetypal self, but the system self. And in systems theory, you think in terms of natural systems, the behavior that we've established scientifically about natural systems. Natural systems, Ludwig von Bertalanffy was one of my early teachers about this, a great theoretical biologist. And a whole school of systems theory came out of the work of Ludwig von Bertalanffy. And it is very widespread in all the sciences. All the sciences operate utilizing systemic concepts. And basically, there's a simple principle. That is, a system is composed of a lot of different parts, but its capacity to function as a totality, as an integrated system, makes it more than the sum of the parts. The clearest example of a system is your body, and it's functioning as a system as long as you're alive. At the moment of your death, it ceases to function as a system, and it breaks down into all of its constituent elements, or many of its functions stop being able to operate. So in systems theory and the systems therapy, you're not focusing on one individual element in the system that you're studying, whether it's a body or a personality system or a family system or an organizational system. You're looking at the total, the integrity of the system's functioning. Stay with me, now this all matters. And so we can do a systems analysis, for example, of an organization like the Mankind Project. We can do it of your family. We can do it of your business. We can do it of a nation's capacity to deal with aggression in its common life. A sophisticated systems theorist out of the Bowenian school, Murray Bowen's outstanding school of systems theory, are working on all these issues. And for them, in order to have real change, you've got to work on the integrity of the system, its capacity to maintain its structural integrity against the forces of chaos in it. And so when you're operating out of a systems perspective, you're attending not to just the symptom, not to the place where the weakness in the system is manifesting. Because if you do that, you're simply attending to the symptom bearer, often the scapegoat in the system. Instead, you address what is going on in the systemic functioning of the system itself. And so when you're a systems therapist of any kind, you are focusing on and addressing the system functioning. And everything you're doing is trying to improve the capacity of that system to function as a whole and to optimize the functioning of its parts through optimizing the system, the functioning of the system as a whole. And in order for that to happen, you have to admit two things. That there are two forces operating in systems. One toward fusion and one toward differentiation. And health in a system is a balance between fusion and differentiation. An adequate balance. If you separate too much from the system, you get chaotic. If you try to get too much into a system, like a day, try to get too much into your day, you get chaotic. If you try to put too little into it, you get bored and you lose energy. So the idea is you want to optimize the tuning of that system function. And you do that a lot of ways. You look at what is causing. Are there fusions which are causing the inadequate functioning of the system? Has this individual got too disconnected from the maintenance of the system? For example, is this a working father or a working mother, or a working father and a working mother who are not attending enough to the system of the family? And therefore the kids are beginning to have symptoms. You follow me? So what you have to do is to work on getting more parental buy-in into the family itself as a system. It's hard today. But now that is a systems theory of change. So each of these theories of change, by looking at the problem differently, they generate different interventions. With a Jungian theory of change, and certainly with my Neo-Jungian theory of change, where I'm putting so much more emphasis on the radical significance of the objective psyche, the grandiose energies that are in the archetypal self, the grandiose energies, the God energies, the dragon energies, which are in the great self, that in my theory of change, now let me just do a Neo-Jungian structural psychoanalytic theory of change. My assumption is I am attending to most of the things that those different theories talk about. They're not irrelevant. Your personal experience is not irrelevant. The trickster mechanisms of your ego, like Freud, are not irrelevant. The autonomous complex is not irrelevant. Your behaviors is not irrelevant. And choosing behaviors which will help you integrate are not irrelevant. Changing your perceptual style is not irrelevant. All these things are relevant in a theory of change that I would propound, including that of a system, paying attention to the system. But here's the key element of my understanding of how change occurs. You are a system self. There are not two. Now, there's not just the archetypal self and the ego, like in classical theory. In my theory, there's the archetypal self, which is the energy-laden code, the great code that's constantly pressing on you to balance the opposites. It's got huge energy, and it never gives up. Your system self, your little s self, your system self, is the actual amount of structuralization you've been able to develop in the cup of your personality. How much actual internalization of structure have you been able to build? And so when we talk later today about building your inner temple, I'm talking about the cup of your system self. Because your system self is not conscious. It is a structure. And we can tell what shape your system self is in by looking at symptom patterns and other kind of markers about how much chaos you're experiencing, where the energy levels in your personality are, whether you're flooded with energy or having a shortage of energy. But we can do all kinds of therapy we can do all kinds of behavioral therapy, all kinds of cognitive therapy, all kinds of other kinds of therapy. But if we're not looking at the system function, the functioning of the system self, we are not aware of what your real problem is. And so, in my theory, there is a clear requirement for fundamental basic structural integrity in the system self, and it's based on the code that is in the archetypal self, the balancing of these four elements, balancing of these four different archetypal energy potentials. It's based on balancing those, but it's also based on learning what to do with the excess archetypal energy that's always coming in. That is the distinctive part of my understanding of your problems and my problems is that I am clear that you can never domesticate the dragon in you. You can never tame it. The great self, the archetypal self, the God self, the dragon in you is going to constantly pour forth more energy than your system self can contain, even if you balance the opposites. Many, many classical Jungians are not clear about that. And many so-called archetypal psychologists haven't a clue about that. The fundamental issue is if you cannot, now stay with me on this now, if you cannot, in the diagnosis of the approach that I have, if you cannot balance your opposites in your personality, these 4 elements that I've delineated, that I talked to you about yesterday, it means that you can only contain so much libido, so much psychic energy, so much dragon energy before you fragment and start acting out, or before your self-system fragments and a symptom forms as a sort of a crutch to maintain your functioning without a psychosis. You follow me? I view symptoms, I've said other places, symptoms to me are like psychological aneurysms. Symptoms come out, manifest, when the structures in your psychological vessels, the walls of your psychological structures, are too weak in that place. And just like an aneurysm, you bulge out. A symptom is a bulge in the structure of your system self. Are you with me on that? A system is a bulge. It's a place where your structure is not strong enough to hold the energy. And so, for me, any adequate theory of change, any adequate approach to healing has got to understand just a few simple things. It's really quite simple. The first thing you have to understand is you're connected to a transpersonal source of energy. If you're an atheist, you don't have to say it's God or divine or sacred. We can use the language of the inherited instinctual old brain, if you want to go that route. The important thing for you to know is that your ego consciousness is a very late and fragile development. And it's sitting on top of a reptile, a literal reptile, the reptilian brain. And so the first thing you have to understand is that your ego is having to deal with forces which are enormous, which are ancient. They are very old. Look at Anthony Stevens' book, The 2 Million Year Old Self. These forces are enormous, and they pour forth continually. They do not stop. They do not regulate themselves. It's very important to get that those things are, it's like a fire hose. It's going out. If you balance your opposites optimally, I mean, not even say optimally, let's just say with Winnicott, if you balance your opposites in a good enough way, you can carry a lot more libido, a lot more psychic energy before you split and form symptoms. And so if you have a lot of symptoms, you just need to realize you got aneurysms, and you got to get about figuring out where that, just like you would treat an aneurysm, where is the balloon coming out of the side of my artery, my psychic artery, in my psychic aorta. Where is it? We've got to stent it. You got to put a stent in there. Integrative psychotherapy at the very basic level, the first thing you do is you want to stent those aneurysms with your psychotherapeutic interventions. And we can discuss it. I want you to get what that means. That means giving people effective crutches to use to stabilize their system functioning until such time as they can optimize and tune it. This is where the differences between counseling, psychotherapy, analysis, and spiritual direction are. Because in my view, counseling, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and spiritual direction all have to pay attention to this plumbing. None of these can operate adequately without understanding this kind of plumbing. Because if you don't understand this plumbing, you have a romantic, idealistic view about what human beings are dealing with. And you haven't faced the dragon, as I say, you haven't faced the dragon. So, in my theory of change, you've got to realize there is this huge fire hose of psychic energy coming into your personality. You can improve your capacity to carry more of that energy and channel it by attempting to balance the opposites very consciously through various interventions, various cognitive techniques, behavioral techniques, imaginal techniques, relational techniques, and so on. But that doesn't fix the problem, because sooner or later your cup is going to run over. See that? That tells you what I'm trying to tell you. Sooner or later, I don't care how symmetrical the top of the glass is. Are you with me? If the glass's side was down like this, it would pour out sooner, right? For the tape, I'm simply using a glass of water as an example of integration structurally in the psyche. So depending on how level and symmetrical the top of the glass is, it will hold more water, more psychic energy, more libido without flooding. But the bad news is the archetypal self doesn't stop. That's our problem in the human species. Why am I teaching you a seminar on the archetype of sacrifice? Because I'm not the first one that figured this out. Human beings, our ancient forebears in different tribes over thousands of years figured this out. And they realized that there is a great primal other in their proximity. And they realize that it's a very ambivalent phenomenon. If they're not connected to it, then they don't have creativity for their crops, for their herds, for their children. But they realized if they are not relating to it properly, it gets very unhappy and attacks them. So all of these sacrificial systems throughout history, all the ones I described to you yesterday, were based on an intuition of this reality. And they developed technologies, partial technologies. The most archaic humans, they would see a person that had lots of psychic energy, and they would try to drink it all. Well, that's a recipe for, that's Dionysian. That's what we talk about as Dionysian, the Dionysian rituals. You just tear it up and you eat the sacred animal. Take it in. And we know that in the Dionysian rituals, things got real crazy. Well, cannibalism's like that. You want to take in that you see it there and want to take it all in. What's the problem with that? Well, that's ecstasy, folks. That is ecstasy. When you're doing that, it is going into ecstasy. And you cannot sustain ecstasy very long. The less structurally organized you are, the less ecstasy you can stand before you fragment. The more balanced you are in the opposites, the more ecstasy you can stand before you fragment. But the problem is, it just keeps coming. So sacrificial ritual developed as a human creative technology to deal with this flooding. And the other means, they would say, well, let's see now. Maybe this is libations, the libation rituals. Well, we've got all this great stuff coming from the great other. and I'm going to show the great other that I know that it's giving me this, so I'm going to pour a libation to it. This is African ritual. You follow me? Are you with me now? This is my acknowledgement to the great other. And since I have acknowledged it, maybe the great other will let me drink out of it without being angry with me. You follow that? Can you get that? You got to get that. You got to feel that in your bones, or you don't understand this stuff. For the tape, I'm pouring a libation on the floor to acknowledge consciously to the primal other that I know where I'm getting the juice. And then I feel, well, maybe now it's not going to be mad at me if I drink myself. And actually, that is very sophisticated. That's very sophisticated. All of the teachings of religions about tithing, in my view, Jewish practices of circumcision are related to this primal sacrificial insight. We're going to offer the deity a part of something precious. The men will understand how precious a part of the penis is. But we offer that to God so that God will then allow us to use our penis fully without inhibition. That is the archetypal language of that. Now, that may not have found its way into Jewish theology. Perhaps it has for some Jewish theologians. But that's the psychological work of that. However, what if I really grow in my spiritual awareness of the great primal other? What if I had been living without very much awareness of the power of God, or the great primal other, or the totem? Whatever is carrying that projection from me. Now stay with me. I'll be done with this in a minute. Stay with me on this. Now, because I'm going over those forms of sacrifice we talked about yesterday. Eating them, cannibalism, eating the totem animal, the sacrifice, the offering of a part, and the participation in the balance. What about the one where they burn it all up and offer it to God? Well, as you get more aware, this is Rudolf Otto, as you get more aware of how enormous, how awe-inspiring, how tremendous this other is, you see, if in the first half of life, it's unlikely that you're going to know how powerful the archetypal self is. It might not be too good for you to know. But let's say whenever you become, whatever age you become, you start becoming aware, whoa, as William James said, the reality of the unseen. There is something with me here. And you start experiencing what a lot of the flatland secularist psychiatrists will call ideas of reference. You start experiencing, whoa, there's something else here. You say, I'm having a paranoid psychotic episode. Well, translate that, whoops, I have lost my repression barrier against the presence of the archetypal self. Now I'm experiencing it. Hello, I know you're there. And depending on how I'm relating to the archetypal self, it can feel like it wants me dead. It can feel like it wants me to prostrate myself and just stay prostrate. It may be, I may experience it as so enormous, so huge, that there's actually no room for me, a human. And I may experience it as so, and you can use this to interpret different religious phenomena, but I can experience this thing is so huge and so powerful and so real, more real than you, that it is shameful for me to dance. And anybody who dances is disrespectful to the great other. There are many, many people like that. The great other is so great that it is shameful for a woman to not have her head covered. Or it's shameful for a woman to not be totally covered. Because this thing is so great, and women manifest all this body stuff, babies and menstruation, and I'm attracted sexually to you, and therefore you must be unclean. Are you with me? This is the phenomenology of religion, folks, and it's happening in the world right now. And so I feel that my loyalty to the primal other, and to have it understand that I'm not its enemy, I've got to knock down the World Trade Center, because all of you infidels are shameful. And therefore, whatever I do, I have to diminish my manifestation of my sort of ordinary human. I've got to cover up femininity. I've got to keep the women from going out on the street. I've got to not eat certain foods. No rock and roll. Don't you just get that? Isn't that perfect? Because obviously, if you're into rock and roll, I mean, you're not really preoccupied with the otherness of the great other. You're kind of in the great other. You're kind of possessed by it. You know, if you're in those ecstatic dance clubs, you know, you're not preoccupied with the great other. So those ritual forms which burn it all and give it to the God are afraid to make much space for the human. Now that is a way a lot of people will relate to the archetypal self if they become aware of it. It crushes the human. And if you are giving it too much power, either consciously or unconsciously, it's crushing your humanity. To give you an example, say the archetypal self comes in, and it comes into you through your warrior sector, and it lights you up like a Christmas tree in the warrior quadrant. And that means all you can do is work. Work on the important mission. There's no time to play. Play is not important. You follow that? That's human. That's shameful. A workaholic really feels that play is shameful. See? So you can just see how that form of sacrificial process is manifest in different ways one is relating to the archetypal self. So in this theory of change, you have to be aware the primal other is huge, it's powerful, it's constantly pouring. It's constantly pouring. It does not stop pouring. It never stops pouring. You balance the opposites. We'll get to this after the break this afternoon. You balance the opposites, and that gets you so you can contain more energy and be more creative and more radiant and more wonderful than you were. And if you notice, boy, there are some really creative people that manage to stay alive. You know, a lot of them get creative and then they self-destruct pretty young, right? Think Elvis, think Janis Joplin. Their cups fragmented, but not until they had gotten a huge amount of juice in them. But sooner or later, that excess starts coming in, and the excess will create chaos. In a spiritual sense, it creates satanic byproducts. whenever the excess energies come over and you don't understand about this sacrificial process, then it's going to start creating really destructive dynamics in the psyche. So what do you need to do? You need, in this theory of change, you have to acknowledge the reality of the primal other, the enormous importance of the reality of the primal other, the fact that it keeps on giving. And you've got to do what you can to optimize the balancing of your opposites so that you can be a better steward of that energy. But you also can't stop there. You've got to learn how to engage in a inner practice which allows you to do something constructive with the excess flow of that archetypal energy. That is the key element here in what I'm trying to teach you. In other words, your complexes, let me go back to complex theory. Your complexes, which cause you trouble, they have been influenced by your personal experiences because particular traumas weaken you in particular sectors. And the classical Jungians were right. At the core of every autonomous complex is an archetypal core, but it's much more specific than they teach. If you will look at your personal autonomous complexes, you will find that one or more of these four energies are at the heart of your autonomous complex. And these primal archetypes that I've talked about, these four elements, are the portal for the flooding in your personality and for the subsequent splitting of your personality. And so in order to deal with your autonomous complex, the first thing you've got to do is to become aware of where the leak is structurally, and then you have to balance your opposites so you can contain more energy before you leak. But that's not enough, right? Why? Because it keeps on coming. And so you have got to develop an inner psychological or spiritual practice which will help you deal with the excess energy creatively. That's what our forebears tried to do with their sacrificial process. And after the break this morning, I'm going to show you how we need to learn from them and to learn from the models in alchemy, which model a way of doing this which is consistent with what I've learned in this structural theory. Now let me stop there and let me invite you to dialogue with me now, because I'm sure I've confused you, but I have said to you what I need to say about this complex theories and the theories of change. So ask me some questions. Yeah.
You have said at some point that everyone's psychology is essentially a personal confession. I think he was referring to his point of view and Freud's point of view. Mm-hmm. And so I find myself a little resistant to hearing your theories for the first time, wondering how much of this, maybe you can help explain, your personal, is this your personal confession about
Sure.
energies that you're dealing with?
Sure.
And how much, and then how you kind of search your process for searching and validating this point of view out your quote unquote scientific side of it. Maybe you can kind of give us a little background, or me a little background about that.
There's always me searching the research, and I'm the first to tell you that I've had to struggle with the flooding of my archetypal energies quite a lot, and I've said to you already that mine have flooded me chiefly through the magician portal, and also secondarily through this warrior portal where I am too workaholic. But through long struggle on this and research, I've realized that, you can't come to integration through only one or two quadrants. I have got to, if I'm going to optimize my balancing of my opposites, I've got to bring in more time to play into my life. That will not make my activities less productive, it'll make them more productive. Contrary to what my personal confession would be, it doesn't make it waste, it's a shameful waste of time. My personal confession is, it's a shameful waste of time for me to play. But my scientific knowledge contradicts my personal confession. And it tells me that if I play more, I will actually be more creative and more productive than I am when I try to express it through a workaholism. So that's one way in which my own personal experience and my own personal confession operates. But I'm not one of those that believes that you can reduce every theory to biography, because there's such a thing as data, comparative data, that a theory has to deal with. And what I'm trying to do is to make sense out of myriads of interdisciplinary and multi-theory data. And, what was the phrase you used? They said personal confession. There's another sense that a theory or a thing is a personal confession, is that we all have our private religions. All of our personalities are little private religions. Adler called them private logic. Well, it's not just private logic. It's a private sacramental system, private sacrificial system, like I was trying to tell you yesterday. We need to know, what is your private sacrificial system, and how well is it working? Could it work better? And that's why we're here, yeah. What
works for me really well in getting this is I've done tremendous amount of work around addictions, and the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step meeting that occurs is a ritual space for confession, so that when the addict, the alcoholic, who is predominantly lover sector privileged, gets flooded, they have a choice. They can go and regulate with some more vodka, which will probably just make it worse. In fact, there's no probably about it. Or they could go to an AA meeting, which is a ritual space, sit down with other people that are struggling with the same thing, have a sense of confession, discuss a step, which is a structure, and have a sense of containment. And it's a spiritual space. It's a ritual space. It's one of the few that we have.
Yes, that's right.
In the secular world.
Thank you, Gary. In fact, it's one of the most effective. And I am a real supporter and proponent of 12-step kind of approach. There is a very important bulwark, what I like to call it. It's a very important form of street magic in healing. What I would like to supplement 12-step programs with, though, is this understanding of the necessity for a structural cure through structural regulation. When I say a structural cure in my work, I'm not into the fantasy that many other therapists are in, that they can cure the psychopathology, cure it. It's like, well, we can work with you and then you're cured and no more problem. I think that is delusional. I think that a structural cure, I always put cure in quotes, because a structural cure means if I am your therapist, I have helped you to regulate more creatively and effectively, to regulate your archetypal energies. And you're going to have to you're going to have to regulate your archetypal energies the rest of your life. It is never going to get easier. Through your life cycle, it's always going to be hard to regulate, to access and regulate your archetypal energies in a creative way. I work a lot with older men in their 70s. And I really enjoy it. I think that you can do a great deal with older men to help them optimize. Too many of them decide that now their task is over, and therefore they don't optimize their personalities. Optimization is possible at 20, and it's possible at 75 or 80. And so it's very important to realize it's going to go on the rest of your life. You can't fix it once and for all. So this idea, well, I've been analyzed now, and now I'm no longer having to deal with my grandiosity, that is a joke. The question is, in my analytical work or in my therapy, have I learned to do a better, more creative, more effective job of relating to this primal other and its energies? If I have, then I am, quote, unquote, cured for now. But when I retire, I'm going to have another problem. Or when I get a divorce, I'm going to have another problem. Or when I lose my job, I'm going to have another problem. When I change careers, I'm going to have another problem. It goes on. Somebody had their hand up over here. Yes.
It seems to me that there's another way to relate to the primal other, and it's a way that you relate without words. Without words.
Oh, yes.
And that it is something that connects within you to what is without. It isn't a question of a ritual. And people will have this kind of mystical experience in different ways. And it creates an inner harmony that has no words. Oh, yeah. And this is an experience that you can have with nature and with music, with small children, in an intense interaction with the patient in a therapeutic situation, but it has no words. Right. But it is the grounding of the relationship.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I think that's what I would call communion.
Yes.
And we're going to be talking about that after our break, because that's where I'm headed. I would argue, however, that even in that there is if you really understand ritual process, there's a ritual dimension to that. It's not an external practice. It's an internal practice. But it's clearly without words. It can be without words. It's what I mean when I say practicing the presence. But I will want to, before we break, what time is it now? Yeah.
When you integrate that into your warrior, the work is no longer workaholic. The play and the work are no longer separated. The work itself becomes the play.
Right. This is Csikszentmihalyi. She's saying that when you get more, what I would say, optimally integrated, then you don't have such a split between work and play. This is the concept of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, flow, the psychology of creativity. And that's what the creativity research shows. I agree with that, yes. Yes, John?
Gestalt, body, work therapies, and psychodrama, how would you characterize them, and do they fit in with your scheme here?
I'm glad you asked that, John, because I was going to come to that in a minute anyway, so thanks for giving me a chance to address that. And this is relevant, and they'll just say this and I'll speak a word to my friends in the Mankind Project International who might hear this tape. John's here representing you folks and a few others. I think this is one of the most important things to ask. Is a Gestalt approach to the psyche equivalent to a Jungian or a Neo-Jungian approach to the psyche? And I would say, I've done a lot of Gestalt therapy. I've spent thousands of hours in Gestalt marathons, and it's very powerful psychotropic work. It opens up the sardine can in a powerful way. But I would argue that it does not really connect you consciously to the primal other. Because in the theoretical framework of Gestalt, as Fritz Perls developed it, and subsequent people, and you know, for you MKP people, the techniques that Ron Herring used when he was originating a lot of the early techniques used in the Brotherhood, he was heavily influenced by Gestalt theory and practices. And if you're not familiar with that, you want to study some of the Gestalt theory and practice. There's an excellent book we all ought to look at. Is Raymond Corsini's Current Psychotherapy still in print? Get the great text by Raymond Corsini, Corsini, Current Psychotherapies, and look at the excellent chapter on Gestalt therapy in there. It's wonderful at helping you relate to your different subpersonalities and parts of your little less self-system which are personal, which are split off. Subpersonalities, fragments of yourself, all of which you're trying. In Gestalt, what you're trying to do is if you dream an image in a dream, all of those images are you. And you have, they really should become I. It should become I. And so when you're taking a Gestalt approach to unconscious materials, you're assuming that all of your personalities that are fragmentary aspects of your personality, which you're relating to in these Gestalt techniques, you know the two-chair technique, do you all know that? You have the different parts of your personality talk to each other, try to get them on better terms. You know, the one that wants to get a divorce and the one that wants to stay married, you have them talk and see if they can come to any kind of clarity, new clarity by working. But this does not acknowledge the transpersonal core of psychological problems. You know, to me, this explains why so many men in so many parts of the men's movement who have used Gestalt types of techniques alone continue to have a terrible struggle with their primitive grandiose issues, their primitive grandiosity. And they continue to be unable to mature enough as men to be able to assume the kind of mentoring and organization building and community building and healing activities, the mature relationships with women that they could develop if they got their grandiosity more regulated, or more, even if they're gay, lesbian, gay or homosexual, more mature relationships with men. So in any case, it's very important to get clear that a Gestalt theory of change is a form of ego psychology, or at best, a form of little s self-psychology. It doesn't really address the problems that personalities, which ones? All of them. The problems that all personalities have, which are grounded in the primal other, the great self, the archetypal self. And one of the huge problems is that if you don't understand the difference between I and the great other, you got a big problem. Because then when you have suicidal thoughts, you'll assume that's your true self talking. When in fact it may be the adversarial manifestation of the great primal other, which is manifesting in an attack on you, what Freud would call the punitive superego. It's manifesting in that form because you have been so disrespectful to its presence. And so there's a sense in which I feel that Gestalt, like any ego psychology, whatever school it's a part of, cannot really finally deal with the roots of human psychopathology. it can be a tremendously useful technique. I utilize Gestalt techniques in my work sometimes, just as I use techniques from these other schools, systems theory from Freud and Adler and so on. But the reason we're having the seminar today is that the archetypal process of sacrificial dynamics, sacrificial ritualization in the psyche has to be done consciously in order to deal with the primal other in a creative way. So I appreciate your asking that, John, because there are a lot of people that do a lot of workshops and do a lot of intensive Gestalt marathons, and they continue to struggle with the overflow of their grandiose acting out just like they did before. And this would be true. This would be my concern about AA too, though. That is to say, you can't just believe in the higher power. You know, it's like if I say, well, it's important for you to believe that the archetypal self exists. Right, I think it is important, theoretically. But what is decisive is not believing in the archetypal self, but as the lady said earlier, it's developing a sense of communion with it. And by that, I mean it's very important to be able to practice a sense of its presence and to have a sense that you're communing with the archetypal self, whether you're speaking in words. Now, you can speak words to the archetypal self. You can, and it would be helpful in some ways to do that. I talk about that in the Facing the Dragon book, and I'm going to write more about that, things that you can usefully say to the archetypal self. But she's absolutely right. When I work on this, my relationship to the archetypal self, much more of it is wordless than words. And much more of my cultivation of this kind of consciousness is without any form of external ritual at all. Although I'm not one that says external rituals are not important. I have to understand that I need to be with other people who know about this. Because if I'm with you know about this stuff and you're trying to deal with the presence of the dragon, and I know that you know about it, and I know you're trying to deal with it, then when we get together, it's like that gives me encouragement to keep trying. In fact, I like to tease people about this. I say, well, I think what I want to do, if you really want to know what I want to do, everybody is an unconscious part of the Fellowship of the Dragon. The Fellowship of the Ring, you've heard of the Fellowship of the Ring? Everybody on the planet, in our species, is an unconscious member of the Fellowship of the Dragon. You don't get to choose. What I would like to see, though, I'd like to see us start, maybe we'll start it today, and you're all charter members. The conscious Fellowship of the Dragon. So that you can say to yourself, I'm going to try to be a member of the Fellowship of the Dragon. And does that require a membership card? No, that's an external deal. What does it require? Well, it requires consciousness and a capacity to take seriously that communion. Because once you acknowledge the reality of that primal other and that it's always with you, and once you resolve to be respectful of that primal other and try to develop a creative communion, that's where we're going, become conscious of the primal other. That's what we're talking about this weekend. That's what our forebears did. They were aware of it. And they sought communion. We need to seek communion with it. We need to seek optimal, conscious communion with it. That is the way we can be the most creative and the most productive. And so you can tell folks that there's a fellowship there's a brotherhood and sisterhood they can become a part of, and all they've got to do is to get conscious about the dragon and resolve to try to practice communing with its presence as creatively as possible. That's the only membership requirements that are required. And I personally believe that the future of our species, which is currently being rapidly going toward the abyss because of unconscious communion with the dragon, which I wrote about in this Facing the Dragon book, I believe if enough folks got conscious, just like this is not new with me, this is Jung and Edinger, if enough people got conscious and joined that fellowship, that conscious fellowship with the dragon, we might have a chance to regulate well enough to get the 100th monkey theory working in our behalf. Yes, thank you.
I wanted to kind of tie two ideas together.
Sure.
The first is that I lead a business that essentially has been the vessel for my development.
I see.
And what I walk away from here with is the language to describe the issues that I'm facing leading that business.
I see.
And the second idea I wanted to tie back to that is, I think Jung talked about directed thinking and fantasy thinking.
Yes.
And the paradox in my life is that I live in this world of highly directed thinkers.
Yeah.
And everything is logical, and it's very adaptable, and they're very successful at their adaptions.
Yes. Yeah.
But what I'm finding, leading this business that's really the vessel for myself, is that it's the fantasy thinking. It's this type of language that enables the fantasy thinking that really, the pouring into the glass, and the analogy with me is that's the opportunity that just keeps coming into my business. And I got to figure out how not to kill the people working for me, nor myself.
Right.
And,
exactly.
and to make it, to deal with it. I'll be interested to hear what you say about that.
As creatively as possible.
Yes.
As creatively as possible. Make your business a vessel for optimal creativity. I work with a number of very high-level businessmen in this country who are very spiritually awake. They feel just like you do. They realize that they, for whatever reason, have been organized in their personality in such a way that they may not be able to do what I want them to be able to do yet. I want them to be able to ride the dragon in a creative friendship and partnership so that the optimum results come. They may not be able to ride it yet, but they got it by the tail and they know it. And they can't turn loose. See, some people, what I call lion men and lion women, these really high performers that have, the cup is real full, and sometimes it's coming right up over the edge, their cup runneth over. The ones that are not spiritually oriented in business, they become very sociopathic, very psychopathic, and you see a lot of this in our corporations right now. You see a lot of very powerful, creative men and women who have gotten the glass so full it's running over, but the energy is spilling over, and they don't have any spiritual means to recognize that energy is not theirs, and so they create hell. Like the Enron fiasco is an example of this. Those people, their cups were running over in the leadership of Enron. Their cups were running over. They did not know what to do with it. And so the overspill created a chaos for all of those employees that lost their entire retirement programs and so on. And the stories keep coming out now. Our corporate leadership in America is having a terrible time. The lion men and lion women of our corporate leadership do not understand this communion with the dragon business. Most of them. But I am here to say that there are some of them that understand its necessity and who are doing everything in their power to try to learn to be respectful of the primal other in their business, in their work. I would go so far as to say that the most conscious of these men and women are actively seeking to make the presence of the primal other a constant, conscious presence in their business, that they are attempting no longer to see themselves as in business alone. They're attempting to see themselves in business in a kind of cooperative, creative partnership with the primal other. And in order to be serious about that attitude, then they have to take a moral stand, a moral commitment about the leadership in their business, for a moral leadership as much as they can muster, and also to have some sense of stewardship over the wealth that is coming out of their creativity. And I'm happy to say that there are increasing numbers of men and women, business leaders, who are very aware of this. It's not the high percentage, but there are increasing numbers who are aware of this, who see their business leadership as only one expression of their spiritual life, and who are seeking to find ways to bring the bounty of the wealth generation that their business is generating to help the poor and the dispossessed of the earth, especially through microcredit kinds of activities, the support of microcredit activities and so on. So your experience that you're describing is, you're not alone in that. And I would just simply say that if you study my work, you will notice that there are certain organizations which tend to result in this kind of lion man and lion woman personality, and we have to not hate them as much in our envy as we often do, especially therapists. Envy is a terrible thing, and when somebody's shining that brightly, it's awfully hard not to envy and hate them. But we need to have empathy for the problem they've got. And I think after this weekend, you will have a sense of what problem they've got. That cup is running over. And nobody has helped them understand what you do when the thing gets up to the top. You follow me? A lot of us think that our psychotherapy would be finished if we could just get the elements balanced so that we could fill up the cup. Most therapists of most schools believe that if we could get the cup full, it would be over with. We would be done. Now we can terminate. See? But there is enormous evidence from both science and comparative mythology and culture, including, did you read the essay on the dragon that came out in the New York Times that I gave you copies of yesterday? If you haven't read it, read that. It's a species-wide problem of dealing with this dragon. And that cup is going to keep running over. So we got to help folks figure out what to do with that excess. Other comments and questions? Yes.
My question has to do with some of the discussion we had yesterday about the media and the entertainment industry and how they deal with such things as violence and sexuality. Mm-hmm. And also the more general question of instincts and passions and primal urges, going back to the Freudian theory of instincts and that. You mentioned that in the context of the Freudian theory of change. Jung, as I have read him, makes a distinction between instincts, primal drives, and the like, and archetypes. Mm-hmm. And he seems to suggest that instincts and primal drives, bodily urges and that, are at a lower level or a deeper level or an animal level, and they are to be differentiated from archetypes. Now, my question is do you
Now,
acknowledge
well,
this
wait a minute.
difference?
Now, we're going to have to respond to some of these before we get too far because there's a lot of important questions here. Let me just say, in response to that thing on instinct and archetype, I think the distinction is overdrawn at the scientific level. If we're talking from a scientific, psychoanalytic level, we're not talking about Jungian spirituality. See, with Jung, you're dealing with a guy who sometimes he's talking with his scientific psychoanalytic hat on. Other times he's talking with his spiritual guru hat on, where he's dealing with ontological issues of the transpersonal dimensions, which are more than psychological. And so I suggest that you look at Anthony Stevens' work, which I respect very much, for an understanding of just how instinctual the archetypes are. The scientific evidence now that we've got about just how instinctual the archetypes are. And in fact, what has happened, for those of you interested in comparative psychoanalytic theory, is it's a lot harder now to maintain these easy distinctions between these theories. Because, quite frankly, I have come back to Freud now, reading it through my theory. And if you read Freud through my theory, it doesn't look like the Freud that I was taught by people that didn't like Freud. Because I know about the id now. Now, the id is the primal other. The question, though, is if you're dealing with this from a neurobiological point of view, there are aspects of archetypal functioning that you can deal with. But you see, I'm also trained in philosophy and theology and comparative spiritual traditions, as Jung was to a degree. And I know, for God's sake, I've studied Whitehead for ages. And I know that there are ways to understand the primal other which are ontological and grounded in the best of contemporary philosophy. And in a way, there is a primal other that's ontologically grounded, if you're speaking spiritually, that transcends the biological wiring. And so there's the distinction that can be made theoretically between the biologically grounded archetype that Anthony Stevens spends so much time with and the ontologically grounded archetypal dimensions of not just humans but other animals and of the cosmos. Those things at some level co-inhere. They're an expression of the same reality. The easy distinction between religion and science and spirituality and science that used to be made by people that didn't know very much can't be sustained anymore in the light of recent philosophical, spiritual, and scientific research. So I want to honor the distinction, but make the point that when I'm speaking to you as a scientific psychoanalyst, for example, I can argue scientifically based on no ontological claims whatsoever, just as Jung said. I can argue that religion is necessary. Spiritual practice, religious and spiritual practice, is necessary if one is to deal with the psychological curse of our species. I can argue that purely scientifically, and have been doing so in my advanced seminars. That doesn't mean I have an ontological claim. It means I'm looking at the literature on evolutionary psychiatry and the evidence about the evolution of religion and the evolution of your God consciousness. And we can explain why that is there. And I'll give you a shorthand. The reason religious practices have evolved, ritual practices, including the ones we're talking about this weekend, the reason they evolved is our species needed it to deal with the flooding of its instinctual energies. And when our species tries to function without benefit of spiritual practice and ritual, it gets crazy. That's what's happening to the world now. But now that's not a theological or spiritual or philosophical interpretation of that. I can do that too. But I am arguing now that all of these therapists that I'm interested in trying to help with their understanding of this stuff, that the therapist who intuit that spirituality is important for their patients, I don't want people to get away with thinking that that's just a little idiosyncrasy on the part of that therapist that's not got any grounding in any scientific reality. The truth is that there's enormous evidence, contrary to what the classical Freudians and many of the early Freudian therapists taught, that religious and spiritual practice helps people cope with the grandiose energies. And you're not going to be able to deal with your symptoms very well if you don't find vessels to deal with them. So that's a long answer to part of your question. Now, what's the rest of it?
One final question is, Jung was a structuralist, and of course this approach is structural.
I'm a structuralist. Yes.
You're a structuralist, yeah. The post-structuralists, the French, like Derrida and Kristeva.
Yeah.
Knowing what I do a little bit about Kristeva is she believes that for psychotherapy, you want to cut through all of these structural constructs, these reifications of phenomena, and get right down to the guts of things. And for her, it's bodily urges, bodily drives, which manifest or express themselves through language. And I'm not sure that she would agree with having all of these constructions in between.
No, she would not.
She would not.
She's sort of like Hillman. They occupy, the post-structuralist, the so-called post-structuralist, occupy. If you have the diagram I gave you, they're in the lover-magician quadrants. The way they think is in the lover-magician quadrants. James Hillman work. You can take my diagram and you can plot all the different theorists where they're operating. And Hillman is operating in that lover-magician territory. It's the magician archetype is a deconstructionist. It's a postmodernist. You got to understand the magician in you. It is not a structuralist, because the magician in you is going to find a lot to see through on my structural declension. But you know what? Postmodernists are anti-scientists. They're anti-science. I teach with a lot of them all the time. They basically are a formula for the Dark Ages, because they really don't believe structure exists. And in my view, the only way you could possibly say what these people say is if you simply are ignorant of the enormity of the growing body of evidence that we are animals, and that our subjectivity is heavily structured by the nature of the species that we are and the way in which our brain has evolved. James Hillman is free to do whatever he wants to do. He's very creative. I need to read more of his work. I've read quite a bit of it. It helps me get more into my lover to read James Hillman's work. He's helping me integrate my lover's circuits. And my warrior, because he's got lots of warrior. He's a double, Hillman's a double Aries. If you know what that means in astrology. Well, he's got lots of warrior energy. But anyway, the problem with that kind of thing is that if you're going to do a scientific psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, if you're going to have a basis for an understanding of the human plumbing such that you can understand what happens in psychopathology and relate it to the scientific evidence and also to the spiritual traditions, what the spiritual traditions teach, and if you're going to come up with a theory upon which you can actually test against data, you have to be a structuralist. Any scientist has to be a structuralist. There's no such thing as a post-structuralist scientist, and I am a scientist. I'm also a philosophical thinker and a spiritual theologian. But when I'm doing that, I'm not operating based on the requirements of science. What I do, however, is when I do spiritual theology, I'm taking the science into consideration. Because if there is I'm kind of a neo-Pythagorean too. I believe the universe is mathematical. And I think, that's Whiteheadian too. The universe and God included is a mathematician. God's a mathematician. When I think about all this science, I think a lot like Whitehead and Tillich think about it. That is, I don't assume I can do good theology or spirituality without tending to what's true scientifically. It's not the last word, but why would I ignore it? It's only grandiosity that wants to ignore it. And so I have been telling my postmodernist friends that their approach to things is the greatest rationalization for continued grandiosity that has been developed lately. It is an intellectual parallel to the international corporation, which is a social form that permits rampant, runaway grandiosity with no limits. So, other comments, questions? Yeah, Bob, and then we can take our break. Yeah.
Viktor Frankl has a book called The Doctor and the Soul, which it stopped me. It had so much in it I couldn't even finish it.
Yes.
I wondered how since you don't hear about it much, or in any case maybe you do, would you put him anywhere in here?
Yes. Viktor Frankl was a really outstanding Austrian psychotherapist that knew Freud and Adler and Jung. He has a very interesting system called logotherapy. I had the privilege when I was 23 years old to study with Viktor Frankl, and in Southern Methodist University in Dallas for a while, and I've reviewed a number of his books. He calls himself the third Viennese school of psychoanalysis. Basically, Viktor Frankl is sort of an Adlerian. He doesn't admit to that. He has a very healthy view of himself, shall we say, if you read between my lines here. That is to say, there hasn't been a very big school of logotherapy. But he is an existential psychologist. And the reason I say he's another crypto-Adlerian, he will even kind of admit to the influence of Adler, is that Adler's psychology, if you really study it in depth, it's an existential psychology, it's a phenomenological psychology, it is what we call a subjective behaviorism. So Adlerian psychology is extremely rich, not nearly as simplistic as a lot of people view it to be. And Frankl is sort of a shining expression of that kind of point of view. His basic thing is, if you have a why for your life, you can stand almost any how. Well, that means, you've got to search for the meaning in your situation and act on the meaning. Don't give in to your despair. It's good. He's very, very close to Paul Tillich in that attitude. Courage, courage, courage. And so I would not put that in any particular quadrant. I think that courage is required in all of the quadrants. And an unwillingness to give in to despair, that is required in human life. One of the things that I told you I'd love to teach some seminars here I'd love to lead a bunch of us through Neumann's Origins and History of Consciousness and some of Neumann's other work, because he has a sense of how powerful the drag of unconsciousness is and how that issues in despair. And it's like, this is too hard. This trying to individuate, this is too hard. And this is all too meaningless. And Frankl had it right. You can't ever go there. No matter if you're in a concentration camp, you can't go there. What would I say is the flaw with his stuff? He does not have an adequate sense of the transpersonal dimensions of that. Like so many existentialists, it's really about the ego's task of having courage, but he doesn't really address where's your ego going to get that courage. In my view, your ego cannot resource its own courage. The archetypal self will give you energy to fuel your courage if you are relating in a communion with the archetypal self. The energy for courage, and I gave some lectures here in which I addressed that. My lectures on the courage to be transformed, I addressed this particular issue. So that's what I would say in a critical appreciation of Frankl. Other comments before we take our break? Then let's take I'll give you longer today since they got us working early and hard, so let's come back at let's take about 25 minutes. Let's come back at about 25 till 12, and then we will go solid to the end. Now we're going to go to this alchemical paradigm. If you have your Alchemical Studies volume number 13, and you can turn to this, these alchemical volumes of Jung's are amazing stuff, and you may want to also look at the book on anatomy of the psyche that Edinger did on alchemy. To get a little sense about why Jung thought alchemy was so important for understanding depth psychology. For what he was doing, Jung really believed that he was sort of a successor to the alchemical adepts, or what I call the magi, the magus, the alchemical magus, the practitioner of this deep knowledge. In Jung's work, he tries to show how the alchemist had insights into the process of getting conscious about the objective psyche, the archetypal self, the lapis, the philosophical tree, Mercurius, all these names for the archetypal self. And in these volumes, you get all this incredible discussion of the way Mercurius manifests. The way the archetypal tree manifests, you can think about that's very much like the Kabbalistic symbolism. But Jung believed that the power of the transformation symbolism in the Mass was very key. And I'm not going to really go in a lot in this context today about his theory of the transformation symbolism in the Mass, except to say that he thought that the symbolism of Jesus functioning as the high priest in presiding over his own sacrificial offering was primal archetypal imagery having to do with this deep process of sacrifice in the inner world. And where he's getting, Jung doesn't just start with the Roman Catholic Mass out here. He's dealing with the sophisticated mystical theological reflections, Catholic mystical theological reflections on the Mass, the ancient ones. He's not looking at recent iterations, which are kind of an ego theology. He's looking at these ancient texts, which would be more primal in their reading of the Mass. And what Jung is telling us is that the alchemist took the symbolism of the Mass, and instead of having it acted out there in the cathedral, he saw the alchemical magus, or all of the alchemical magi, the alchemical adept, actually doing this kind of thing intrapsychically. in the inner temple. And if you look on pages 324 and 325 and following, this whole section is a description of the perils of being someone trying to do this inner conscious sacrifice in the inner temple. This whole section here, it's a text from Chinese alchemy, and it's describing this inner space. And he's talking about, I get this, I'm gonna read this slowly, and then I'm gonna just tell you what I think we're hearing. Wei Po Yang, starts with paragraph 432. Wei Po Yang, the oldest Chinese alchemist known to us, 2nd century A.D., gives an instructive account of the dangerous consequences of making mistakes during the opus, that is, the work, the inner work. It's dangerous stuff, he's saying. After a brief resume of the danger of mistakes, he describes the Qin Yin, which means the true or complete man, who is the beginning and end of the work. This would be translated by us as, this is the person whose ego is no longer the center, but, as we've been saying this weekend, is trying to be in this field of relationship with the archetypal self, the communion with the archetypal self. And here's what he says, this Chinese alchemist says, in describing this complete person. And you'll see the implication is you're not a complete person if you're operating just out of your ego. The ego has to be relating to the primal other. The complete person, quote, he is and he is not. He is and he is not. So, I am, but I am something different from just the I am that I was before I started this communion. This is like the poetry of Rumi. Rumi, in his poems, if you really want to get a feeling for somebody that's right in this zone of communion with the great other, you read the poetry of Rumi. There's a sense in which the dragon's presence is clearly manifesting in me now. And so I am not just Robert Moore ego. There's something bigger than me in here. And so I am Robert Moore. I am Gary Shank. But there's something more than that in here. This person resembles a vast pool of water, suddenly sinking and suddenly floating. Think about that now in the light of our discussion. Sometimes sinking and sometimes floating. In other words, don't get cocky. Sometimes you're flooding. And sometimes the archetypal self sort of floods over you and you become an expression of it. Not Robert or Gary or John. Do you get that? So sometimes, especially when you regress, as my friend John Lee says, you turn into a 2-year-old. And it's not your adult self that's there in that relationship, it's that 2-year-old. Even though you have a big body. Read John's book, Growing Yourself Back Up. It's a great discussion of this. What you need to understand is, not only is the 2-year-old, but behind that acting out 2-year-old is a lot of dragon juice. That's not just a little kid, that's dragon stuff coming through that angry 2-year-old. This person appears as a material substance. That is, it's not just an imaginal reality. There really is a structure here. In other words, this is not just a fantasy. When you get into this conscious communion with the great self, there really is a structure to that. He appears as a material substance. And in it are, get this quote, in it are mixed the squareness, 4 sides, the roundness. Jung always talked about the round being an image of wholeness, an image of the self, the archetypal self. There are mixed the squareness, the roundness, the diameter, and the dimensions. This is geometry, friends. The dimensions, which restrain one another, like I have told you that the different elements have to restrain each other. It's not just the government that has to have checks and balances. Your psyche has to have checks and balances like a government that's functioning right. In fact, it would be interesting to think about the archetypal grounds of the different branches of government. Okay, but back to the quote, which restrain one another, having been in existence before the beginning of the heavens and the earth. That is, this squareness which restrains each other, the elements which restrain each other are archetypal. They're not personal. They've been in existence before the foundations of the earth. That is to say, that they are grounded archetypally. The author goes on to speak, this is paragraph 433. The author goes on to speak of a region, quote, closed on all sides. Now we're getting into the inner temple. Your structurally integrated, little s self-system that through great effort you have created by working to balance the opposites. Its interior is made up of intercommunicating labyrinths. Intercommunicating labyrinths. Not one labyrinth, 4 labyrinths is what it's saying. There are 4 intercommunicating labyrinths. In this space, in this region, the implication is, quote, the protection for the adept, for the practitioner, for you, if you're in there doing your conscious sacrificial work, the protection is so complete as to turn back all that is devilish and undesirable. In other words, if you are in this inner temple and you're conscious and you're respectfully, authentically offering your offerings to the primal other, the satanic results or consequences of overflowing archetypal energy subsides. Do you get that? Are you with me on that? If you're in that balanced inner temple, authentically, consciously, respectfully, the satanic consequences of overflowing of archetypal energy subsides. When you're in this space, quote, cessation of thought is desirable and worries are preposterous. Read that. This is an affirmation of what you were saying a while ago. The most important thing is not thought. You were saying the most important thing is not talking, but the most important thing is also not thought. What is important? It's the communion. It's being in the presence consciously, being with the primal other, being there, knowing you're there, knowing it's there, being respectful. This is a concrete representation of what Edinger talks about is when you have an ego archetype axis, when you have the ego self axis. That is, this is what it really means to have an ego self axis. And the worries are preposterous. This simply means that you're in the zone. You are in the synchronistic zone. This is what Jung has always affirmed, that if you're really in a right relationship with the archetypal self, synchronicities will tend to constellate. And there will be more of a creative flow to events in your life. That is what the alchemist is affirming. Jung saw that, Edinger saw that. All the folks that are fascinated with synchronicity see that. Get this now. Quote, "The divine chi fills the quarters." Now think about what we've been saying. The divine chi, that's sacred energy, read that libido, fills the quarters, and it cannot be held back. I just got through telling you, it cannot be held back, right? It's going to flow into those four quarters. Whoever retains it will prosper. That is, whoever is able to utilize the chi that flows in there creatively will prosper. Why? Because it makes you creative, unimaginatively creative. These lion men and women that I work with, they are incredibly creative. That's not their problem, getting creative. The problem is not letting it go bad on them. And he says, and he who loses it will perish. If you listen to my lectures I gave recently as a predecessor to these on transforming fire, accessing and optimizing your spiritual energy, psychological spiritual energies, I point out in there that there's increasing evidence that you get ill, your immune system starts going down when your archetypal energy in your physical systems gets too low. Depression is an expression of the accessible archetypal energy, getting too low. Even the Bowen theorists, the Bowen systems theorists are arguing that now, based on their creative bridging of neurophysiology, recent brain research, and systems theory. They are arguing that we are all dealing with energy dynamics, and when the energy in the body gets to the point where it is not accessible at a fairly adequate level, you get not only depression, you get immune system problems. And the assumption being that for your immune system to function adequately, there's got to be enough chi. So what else is new, right? All the Chinese medical types tell us that. There's a lot of other scientific evidence that supports that now. So you can lose this chi by not having the four squareness of the temple set up, and it'll leak. Or you can lose the chi, and I think this is the one he's talking about. Get this now. I think the alchemist here is talking about the overflow of the chi, the wasted, the excess that's not dealt with consciously. Listen to this. For the latter, that means the one that's going to perish. Are you following me on this? Are you getting what he's saying here and how it relates to what we've been talking about? For the latter will employ the, quote, false method, unquote. He's talking about the alchemical practitioner. Read that, personality or psychotherapist, who's employing the false method. Now let's listen to what the false method is. He will direct himself in all things by the course of the sun and stars. In other words, will lead a rationally ordered life in accordance with the rules of Chinese conduct. In other words, he attempts to function out of his ego. It's ego psychology. He's doing what he knows to be the right thing out of the best he knows about what to do about rational psychotherapy. See? But this is not pleasing to the Tao of the feminine principle, the yin. That is the part of the Tao which is not in the ego's activity. The part where you have to give over. You got to commune, right? And Jung continues, he says, or as we should say, the person is operating according to the ordering principles of consciousness. And these principles are not in harmony with the unconscious. If the practitioner at this point orders his life according to rules traditionally regarded as rational, he brings himself into danger. Now that's what we've been talking about. Why is that? Somebody tell me from what we've talked about, based on what we've talked about this weekend. Why does that bring you into danger? Operating out of the rational functioning of the ego. You're functioning as if you are the center, and there's no other important center you're supposed to be in communion with. You're running it. You're the master. You're in control. This, of course, is the definition of sorcery or black magic. When you're practicing all this stuff without reverence for the great other. And he says this, quote, disaster will come to the black mass, unquote. What is the black mass? It is a mass which is done without reverence for the great other, for one's own egocentric agenda. So what he's saying is, he says, the black mass is the massa confusa, the chaos of Western alchemy, the prima materia, which is like lead. It is the Qin Yin. That is, the Qin Yin is the whole man or person, hidden in the darkness, the whole man who is threatened by the rational and correct conduct of life. That is, so your whole person is threatened if you operate solely out of the ego. Individuation is hindered or deflected into the wrong path. So now picture this. This is what he's saying. This is exactly what we've been talking about this weekend. When a person is operating in this ego way, without reference to the communion with the great other, they're doing sorcery. And, quote, here's Jung continuing, the chi, that is the sacred energy, the libido, the quintessence, the rose-colored blood of Western alchemy, which he identifies with this libido, cannot be held back. And the self then struggles to make itself manifest and threatens to overpower consciousness. So in other words, when it overflows, the chi is going to come anyway. No matter if you're working out of your ego, the chi is going to come anyway. And it's going to threaten, it's going to become adversarial, and it's going to start making you act out. This danger was particularly great for the Western alchemist because of the ideal of the imitation of Christ, the imitatio Christi, led him to regard the sweating out of the soul substance as a task that had actually been enjoined upon him. He felt morally obliged to realize the demands of the self, regardless of whether these demands taxed him too highly. It seemed to the alchemist that God and his highest moral principles required this self-sacrifice. In other words, this would be like a typical person that is they're so spiritual, they don't take care of their human being. And that would be a form of sacrifice that we've talked about today. You're so trying to be so obedient that you destroy your human life. And then Jung goes on to say, are you with me so far on this? This is astounding to me, see. It is indeed, Jung says, a self-sacrifice. When a man gives way to the urgency of these demands and perishes, for then the self, the archetypal self, has lost the game as well. In other words, if your archetypal self, in continuing to come forth against the rigidity of your ego, destroys you as a person, the self has not won. The archetypal self has not won either. It's lost too. Because all that potential that you could realize, all of that creativity that you could do, is destroyed. It happens to all these creative people, to these singers, these artists, Pollock. That's what happened to Pollock. For the self has lost the game as well, meaning the archetypal self, having destroyed the human being who should have been its vessel. The archetypal self has destroyed the human being that should have been its vessel, read its temple. This danger, I'm almost through. This danger, as the Chinese master rightly observes, occurs when the traditional moral and rational principles of conduct are put into force at a moment when something other than social life is in question, namely the integration of the unconscious and the process of individuation, which translates out to what we've been saying. It's when you use your ego approach in the best rational way and you don't attend to the reality of the objective psyche and the importance of communing with the archetypal self in the inner temple. So I've summarized here what I think is sort of the alchemical paradigm for what we've been talking about in terms of trying to optimize the sacrificial process. See, Jung, I think, would argue, and based on what we've talked about this weekend, I think there's some merit to the argument, that here we see sacrificial process required at its highest level. And what is that? Well, let's look at the elements here about this vision. What do you have to have? Well, in alchemy, you start with the massa confusa. Let me just translate that in terms of what I've been talking about. The massa confusa is your life prior to coming to conscious awareness of the four elements and the need to differentiate yourself from the archetypal self. In Murray Bowen's family systems terms, it would be called fusion states. In psychoanalytic self-psychology terms, after the Kohut in his school, it would be called merger states. Self-object merger states. That is to say, there's not enough differentiation here in the personality in any form. But what I would simply add from what I'm teaching you this weekend is that when you're in a regressive merger with your family or with your parents or with another person, that's an archetypal phenomenon. You are not seeing this person as a human being. You're seeing them as an archetypal. You're idealizing that human being, whether it's your mother, your father, your sister, your brother. Another place where the Adlerians, I think, are so helpful, they understand that idealizations of siblings are just as crippling, and often even more so, than idealizations of parents. But in any case, fusion states, as talked about in systems theory, are really archetypal projections upon human persons. And so whenever you're still living your life in these archetypal fields that you create through archetypal needs and archetypal projections, your life is going to be a mass of confusion and chaos. It's a rule. Take it to the bank. So what do you got to do first? Well, you got to differentiate. As the alchemist says, you've got to discover the 4 elements, and you've got to figure out how they're organized in your personality system. What is wrong with your self system that it's not square? Because if your self system, quote, is not square, then you're trying to deal with the power of the circle, totality, but you don't have the structuralization which will enable you to have the best chance at doing that. You with me? You see that? Does that make sense? Because the alchemist says it's got to be square. If it's square, it's safe in there, at least up to a point. We get to that point in a minute. But I say the more square it is, the more safe it is. So what he's talking about is balancing those opposites as adequately as you can so that it's a vessel. And the more it's a vessel with structural integrity, it can handle more archetypal energy, more chi, without fragmenting and creating more chaos. Or we could say that without going back into more regressive self-object fusions or more regressive fusions with my family constellation. You with me? See that? Because when we regress, we go back into regressive fusions with our our significant others. It's a rule. All of us. So anyway, building the inner temple. So the inner temple, in my view, is simply a way of talking about the system self, which is 4 square. Balancing those opposites so that libido, the id's energies, can come in and be utilized without engaging in infantile, regressive, archaic behaviors that destroy the person, its relationships, its organizations, its country, the world. But the problem that the alchemist says, Jung points out, that the chi keeps coming, even when the inner vessel is 4 square. You with me? It keeps coming. The chi keeps coming. There's going to be more of it flowing. Less of it leaking. The cup is going to run over. My cup runneth over. Your cup is going to run over. It always is going to run over, but we're talking about a really full cup now. We're in Rumi territory now. And if you've ever read Rumi's poetry, when he gets to rocking in his poetry, especially Coleman Barks translations, and if you want to get into a little ecstasy, you listen to Coleman Barks read Rumi. It's awesome stuff. I get a little weird when I hear that stuff. But anyway, when it starts flowing in there, then you're going to have a full cup, and as Rumi says, the mountains start turning into ruby. You're looking at these mountains, and they are not mountains, boy, they start glowing. They are rubies. And that's another way of saying everything I look at, when my cup starts getting full like that, I'm in ecstasy. I'm experiencing joy. I'm looking out, and no longer are you just these ordinary gray people, what you are. I start seeing you as you really are. I start seeing you as jewels in Indra's necklace. And that's an ecstatic vision. That's William Blake. And that really exists, and that's really in you, and you have that capacity to fly in that zone. You can be the Michael Jordan of your life in the zone. But it's dangerous. So when that chalice is overflowing, as it's going to if you power up, then you've got to step into your inner priesthood. Do you get that? You have to step into that then. And the imitatio Christi, that is the imitation of Christ, this is what Jung is saying that the alchemist knew, that Christ's sacrifice can't fix your grandiosity. He can't fix it for you. Theologically, you can say Christ did some incredible cosmic act. But if you're doing a Christian theological thing, you would have to say Yes, Christ did some incredible cosmic work, decisive, perhaps that only Christ could do. Christians will argue that. But it doesn't get you out of stepping up to this part of the priesthood of all believers. And so there is an inner priesthood, and when I'm telling all these men and women that they've got to step up to be magi, that every person, just like in the Australian Aborigines, you've got to carry your part of the song line. You can't assign it to the ordained clergy or the certified therapist or the licensed psychologists and social workers. You can't assign it. Everybody has to step up into this priesthood. And the chalice inside you, when you're really powering up and you're in this relation, when you're really making it possible for that chi to build up, it's overflowing. So the question is, what are you going to do with the excess? In your activity in the inner temple, you have got to be able, in your conscious communion with the great other, this is what I call getting conscious about your offerings to the dragon. The flow that our primordial predecessors said has to be between the God and the person. They knew something. Because what they were saying is, if this is working right, those ancient people were saying, if this sacrificial business is working right, the God and I are going to be on better terms. And the God is going to share the God's energy and plenitude with me. And I'm going to take that plenitude and I'm going to share it with my tribe, my people. And instead of scarcity, there's going to be enough for a feast. That is what the ancient people believed. And if I don't get into this right relationship with the God or the spirit or the ancestor, my people will starve because there won't be enough creative, productive energy there. So they knew that they needed to return something to the great other. And what I'm saying to you in this workshop this weekend is, you can understand what it is you need to give back to the dragon. It's not a big mystery. You need to figure out which part of your archetypal energies you're not regulating creatively. Because they're not, if you're not regulating them creatively, they haven't gone anywhere except in projections, idealizing projections on other people or into your symptoms. They've gone into your symptoms. They've caused your aneurysms. But you have got to figure out where that excess overflow, no matter how well your cup is balanced, your cup is overflowing, no matter how poorly structured you are. Do you see that? Even if you're real one-sided, your cup is overflowing. You've got to figure out where it's going, and you've got to get conscious about that excess being given back to the dragon. This is what a Christian would call a Eucharistic image. Jung is saying it may be a Christian Eucharistic image, but it's not just Christian. Jung thinks that this is a process which is human, and that the necessity of this sacrificial process is species-wide. You've got to return that, any chi, are you with me? Any chi that's running over your cup side has to be consciously given back to the dragon. You have to say to the dragon, in effect, and this is some words you do need to say. You need to say, take this golden energy of yours that I have not become adequate in channeling creatively for the world and for my life and for my family and my friends, and receive this back, and then if it please you, give it back to me again in a form I can deal with creatively. That is the image that you see so much in the Christian scriptures and in other ritual literature about, I bring my human offering, the God, whoever it is, receives it, and then, as the ancestors said, the God gives it back in form you can use, a crop or a calf or a lamb or a plant that can be eaten. Yeah.
What happens if a client who is aware of where this is being regulated but is incapable of doing what you just said or mentioned, for whatever reason?
Incapable of disidentifying with the great dragon.
Regulation isn't working, they can't do anything about it.
Well, won't do anything about it. Well, Jung's quote applies to that. When an individual is riding on all this chi, archetypal energy, and they are unwilling to admit that it's creating chaos in their life, and they're unwilling to bring it into the conscious communion with the great primal other in the psyche, they are going to be harmed, inevitably. But the tragedy of it is not just that they are going to be harmed. We in these days, don't we talk about collateral damage, right? The enormity of the collateral damage around those who are so haughty in their personality structure that they will not say to the archetypal self, I'm not doing very well with this energy. It's making me an addict. It's making me eat more than my human body needs. It's making me eat less than my human body needs. It's making me be addictive in my work habits. It's making me be addictive in my codependency. It's making me be masochistic in my relationships. You fill in the blank. It's making me blank. From this kind of point of view, you have to get that conscious and spoken between you and the primal other. It may not be in words, it may be thoughts. Maybe thoughts that you think in your communion with the primal other. But it can't be just sitting there meditating. A lot of meditation encourages a merger with the archetypal self. Meditation forms which encourage you, for example, as a lot of the stuff Ken Wilber teaches, it's a magician inflation. And you start getting into this kind of fantasy that I am the great self. A lot of Ken Wilber's teaching, as brilliant as it is, and I love what he does with interdisciplinary models. He and I are very similar on the view of thinking in an integrated way about all this hierarchy of disciplines and area sectors in human and physical life. I agree with him on that. But when he starts to privileging the magician sector to the degree that he does, he, like the postmodernists, in my view, are in a magician inflation, massive magician inflation. Well, you really are, if you were really spiritually enlightened, you have to realize that you are the great self. Well, at the farther reaches of mystical attainment of the avatar, such as you see probably in Rumi, that may be so. But to teach that without care to people as a model for their functioning, ooh, that's dangerous. Are you with me on that? Do you see why it would be dangerous? I teach you to meditate so you can feel like you're one with the great self. What's the problem with that? Somebody tell me.
So you think you are the great self. Narcissism.
Fantastic narcissism, not expressed in the royal sector like the typical narcissistic personality disorder. You don't look like the narcissistic personality disorder, probably. But what do you look like? You look like a monk. You look like a holy man. Well, folks, when you look like a holy man, the chances are real good that you're very inflated in the magician sector. And from my point of view, the proof is on you to show how that's not so. And it's like one of the ways you can tell is that people that are really into these magician inflations, they're not too worried about actually doing anything, planning anything to solve the problems of the poor of the world. Most of them are going to meditate. And they're not going to do much about supporting the furthering of microcredit in the world, so forth like that. So anyway, in this thing, and then I'm going to open it up for you, because this is where I think this is the optimum sacrificial process. It's got to be inner. You've got to do it yourself. Jesus can't do it for you. The Buddha can't do it for you. Jung can't do it for you. You have to step up to your inner priesthood. And you've got to express gratitude for the creative energies that you've received and that you've done as well as you could with. And so as my African American friends say, down at Trinity United Church of Christ in the South Side, they say, you really want to be spiritual? You practice an attitude of gratitude. That's real spirituality. Attitude of gratitude. But they're clear about it's not to the ego. You have an attitude of gratitude toward the primal other, toward the great other. And that's the first thing, praise. That's why in worship there's always you praise first. Before you do anything, you praise before you ask anything. You praise in order to get clear about what the situation is. Then you return the excess to the other. Think of those things in the Mass. I don't know, I'm not a Catholic, but I often go to Mass. Because I think it's so incredibly archetypally true. Because all these little girls and these little boys, if you go to the cathedral here, all these people from different races and different walks of life, all different social and economic classes, they get together and they have them and they carry the elements up the aisle. And those elements symbolize all about us that is our human. It's what we are. And it is being carried up to the high priest, just as the loaves and the fishes were given to the high priest in the time of the Gospels, in the stories of the Gospels. The loaves and the fishes taken to the high priest. And the high priest takes the loaves and the fishes, or the elements in the Mass, and consecrating them, and declaring them the mystical body. This is my body. Feed on me. This is my blood. Read that life energy. Drink this. And the image in the Gospels and the Christian myth is that then the number of fish and loaves explodes. It's the same archetypal pattern between the changing of water into wine. Are you with me on that? You see this archetypally? And you can have a party. There's so much. There is so much that after you feed everybody, there's a lot left over. Well, that's exactly what this is talking about. There's a lot left. There's always a lot left over if you're in the communion. But you gotta remember, who is that? That which is left over hadn't been eaten, hadn't been put to creative use. It has to go back to the primal other. Do you see that? Can you get the archetypal symbolism there? That, I believe, is why Jung felt that the Mass was such incredible primal symbolism of the individuation transformative process. And so, as in the myth, in Jung, if you study his alchemical works, you see this symbolism. The dragon is feeding on the dragon's tail, the Ouroboros. The primal dragon, Ouroboros. I could show you the diagram in here if I could find it. It's in Neumann's Origin History of Consciousness. The great serpent eating its tail. It is the dragon feeding the dragon. But not just the dragon. The dragon is not the only one getting fed when the loaves and the fishes come up. Everybody else gets fed. And I speak in this Facing the Dragon book about the Messianic Banquet, the legend of the Messianic Banquet, which says, when the Messiah comes, everyone will feed on the body of Leviathan, the body of the great beast will be divided up, and in the Messianic Banquet, everyone will feed on it. And I say in this Facing the Dragon book that I think that is a mythic representation of what we're talking about. If you learn to offer the excess dragon energies in you back to the dragon consciously in communion, and it doesn't have to be verbal, it's practicing the presence, then the energy can flow in through you in such a creative and radiant way that, as Rumi says, you may become a sheikh. That is a vessel of this energy. And then folks may rise from the dead around you all over the place. That is, that transformative, redemptive energy will be coming in, you'll be in effect channeling it. Instead of channeling satanic energy and acting out, you'll be channeling radiant, transformative, redemptive energy through your life. And the beautiful part about it is, according to these stories and these images, is it won't feel, it's just like you said earlier, it won't feel like work. All of the redemptive work you do and the offerings you make will feel like play. And that takes us to, D.H. Lawrence understood that. He understood that if you're really in the heart of love in your life and you're really connected to the deepest parts of what you are as a human being, the acts of kindness and mercy that you express will not be out of duty. It'll be coming out of your ecstasy and your joy. So that is what I think this stuff is about, and that's why I decided to teach the seminar, because I really believe that what Jung and Edinger is trying to show us is that there really is a sacrificial process that has to happen if you're going to optimize your relationship to the self and not be crazy or, depressed or manic, one of the two. So I've got some time here now. Let me open it up for questions and answers and discussions. This is a lot of stuff, but I think you can see why I believe that it's not a throwaway. It's not really an option for effective healing, either psychological or spiritual, to ignore the actual reality of this primal other. And again, I say, you can call that primal other the reptilian old being that lives in you, if you want to reduce it to evolutionary models. But whatever you call it, you need to relate to it and commune with it consciously. Otherwise, the price is really too high for you and those you're in a relationship with. Okay, let me open it up. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Energy.
Yes.
How would you guide them to try to give it back? I mean, what practical
Well, it
steps?
depends upon where they are in terms of what type of she's asking me, practically speaking, what would I do in terms of of relating to an analysand or a psychotherapy client or a counseling client that's having this kind of problem. Well, see, this is what needs to be taught in terms of not only differential diagnosis, but differential treatment planning. Because what I would do if they were a very loosely organized person coming in for brief counseling to me, and I was going to have about 1 or 2 or 3 sessions with them, would be very different from what I would do with them if they could become a psychotherapy client for more than just brief supportive therapy. And this is what I'm trying to teach in these seminars. I'm trying to show that this is the plumbing, period. This is the plumbing. If I'm a counselor, what does this make me do in relationship to that person that comes in my office? I'm going to try to run quickly through what I would do if they were a counseling client, a psychotherapy client, an analytical client, and so on. If it's a counseling client, the first thing I've got in mind is this is a system self that's in great trouble. They're much more fragile than I might think if I was not trained in this. Therefore, I'm going to be very, very firm and assertive in helping them find crutches to contain this flood. I'm going to refer them to a 12-step program, for example, if they're having addictive problems. I'm going to be very assertive about that. A lot of therapists are ineffectual because with clients that need them to be very directive, they're very passive. They read the book on how you shouldn't be a directive therapist because you're not as smart if you're a directive therapist as you are if you're really sitting back in a cool, dynamic therapist. Well, if I've got somebody that's drowning in their archetypal energy, I'm going to move powerfully, decisively. I'm going to mobilize all sorts of extra therapeutic resources to shore them up, to keep them from the edge of the abyss. I'm going to do it unashamedly, I'm going to do it aggressively, and I hope I'm going to do it as effectively as possible. And I'm going to do it in a teamwork with all sorts of people, their pastor, their family members, their teachers, whoever I can find to help be allies in this treatment team. So at that level, I'm thinking, in fact, any therapist that doesn't think treatment team, as far as I'm concerned, is doing malpractice. Any of them, including the analyst. But now that's if I have just a few sessions. If they are in a position where they can come see me, they're loosely organized, they can come see me more frequently because of their circumstances in life, I will still do that part. I will move to try to provide the prostheses. Think flying buttress in a cathedral. I'm going to try to put some crutches out there to shore up that self where I see them about to collapse. I'm going to do that in a multidimensional way. But depending on their level of organization, which is relatively easy to assess, in other words, how much integrity, structural integrity, does this self-system, little s self-system have? Because if it has a little structural integrity, if I provide that kind of support, I can get them stabilized. They're not cured. I may medicate. I may get them some medication. But I'm clear in my mind, this is not a cure. The medication is a part of the comprehensive treatment plan for me to help keep them from the edge of the abyss. So I may go there if I feel it's needed. And I make that judgment based on whether or not I think that it will be the most productive contribution to their being able to start regulating better. Then I'm going to, this is what they do a lot of teaching about this down at the Adler Institute. Harold Mozak used to say to me, and all of us say, just because somebody comes to you for therapy doesn't mean they're really a client. Just because they pay you and come in, or just because they arrive in your office and occupy that chair, don't get into the idea that that person is in therapy with you. And what Harold meant was, you have got to create a cooperative relationship with that person, what we call a therapeutic alliance. So I'm working on my therapeutic alliance like mad. And I'm using every intuition, every what little bit of a feeling function I've got. What little bit of an intuitive capacity I've got. I'm going to use every tool in my arsenal to help that person see me as not an enemy. And it's with different people, that's very different. You got to figure out who's sitting there, and then you've got to try to position yourself in a way that they can access you. There's a lot of literature in self-psychology now on this. You've got to be really, really aware that you can't be the same way with each person that comes to you. You've got to be like a mother with an infant. You've got to be like a mother. You have to be intuitive with what that infant is saying to you. And you've got to arrange yourself so that breast feels accessible to that infant. Because if it doesn't feel accessible to that infant will not be able to nurse. And this is the maieutic function of a therapist. So in other words, you immediately are cut into trying to establish that a minimum beginning bond. And one of the things that people need to learn is different personality structures are vastly all over the place on how well they can bond. It's that attachment theory stuff. You've got to be aware that some people can attach because of their particular disorder. They're real good at attaching. Other people, because of their disorder, if they have detached disorders, or if they have royal disorders, or if they have warrior disorders, they may have a tremendous difficulty attaching. And so the challenge then is immediately to move toward is processing as quickly as you can. How can I position myself to become available here? So a lot of failed therapies, we therapists say, oh, that client was crazy. What translates that, I was so unempathic, and I was so insensitive, and I was so narcissistic, I needed them to relate to me in the way that I've been taught they need to relate to me. And so anyway, that's the second thing you do. While you're doing that while you're doing that other thing. And all the time you're trying to do a multidimensional assessment of what's sitting there in that chair. In other words, you've got to figure out what is happening to that self-system. Is that self-system faltering because it's not getting enough energy? Is that self-system faltering because it's drowning in energy? Where are the leaks in it? Because if you don't know the structure of the fragmentation, you can't create a sensible treatment plan. You'll treat them like everybody else. Well, what's an effective treatment plan for one person may be damaging to the next. And this is what Milan and I both, Theodore Milan and I, totally agree on this. Integrative psychotherapy is not a brainless eclecticism. Integrative psychotherapy has to be able to figure out what is the problem this person's got, and then draw on techniques that are the most helpful for that particular problem. There are some techniques which are helpful for person A that if you use them with person B will push person B into a psychosis or a suicide. And so if the person is going to be able to see me for therapy, I'm doing all this. And my goal in therapy is to stabilize that self-system and then start trying to help them work toward actually changing the structure. In counseling, you cannot address the structural deficits except for prosthetic means. And they're better than nothing, including medication. Medication is not a structural correction in most cases. A few, yes. Most of them, no. Then you move toward, you've got to do what we've talked about here. You've got to figure out where the structural deficit is. You've got to figure out what you need to do in an integrated, drawing upon integrative interventions. What will help them address that? And it needs to be multidimensional. It should not be limited to what one school of thought taught you. And when Milan and I recommend using a multitude of techniques, we're not saying that all theories are equal. We are saying that you choose an intervention based on what is wrong with a person, not based on your theoretical tribe. And that's what real integrative psychotherapy would function like that, based on the best scientific evidence that we have and the best clinical evidence that we have. So then that's what I would want to do in psychotherapy. And my goal is to make structural changes in the little s self-system of that personality. Because at that level, the person can benefit tremendously by just balancing the saucer of their vessel. I mean, just balancing it. If they balance it some, it will contain a lot more archetypal energy without making them crazy. So they don't have the lion man or the lion woman problem yet. They can't keep enough energy in there to get that crazy, usually. It goes into, it leaks out fast. So that's a psychotherapy client. With a psychotherapy client, how far do you take a psychotherapy client in terms of optimization of system function? Well, you can take them as far as they want to go, and can go in terms of their resources, and can conceivably go, that is, you can introduce optimization techniques such as dream interpretation, active imagination, all sorts of things, if you think, based on careful assessment, that their structure is such that it won't make them crazier. This is one of the things that concerns me about people using Gestalt therapy techniques. A lot of the time they will use a Gestalt therapy technique whether or not it's going to make the person crazier. And I'll tell you, with a loosely organized personality, when you go to trying to deal with affects first, and you try to rev up that primitive affect rage, get them to do psychodrama with beating the pillow or whatever, getting them into all their rage toward their parents or whoever they're enraged with. If they're loosely organized, that's malpractice in my view. Because you're flooding them with archaic energies, and they're struggling with those anyway. They were struggling with those before they got into that use of that powerful psychotropic technique. You follow me? So that's what really bugs me about people, like, for example, people that have been the victims of child sexual abuse, and you get these therapists who want to take them back through the story. Take them back through the story. Tell me more about your traumatization. Let's really tell the story. We're going to heal you through telling the story. Ooh, boy. That is so bad. Because they're already flooded in primitive affects. They need structure. And so in other words, some people I will terminate in therapy if I make a decision that if I try to get them opened up to more sectors, that the chances are, the statistical probability is that I'm going to really sink their boat in the effort to help them. And that's the medical ethics, do no harm. And you have got to make that judgment call as a therapist. And it is every client, every period of the therapy, you've got to make that judgment. Whether to go further would make them much more in danger. And that's a big responsibility. But when you volunteer to become a therapist, you assume that. And but with some people, they either had when they came in, or they developed the capacity to be a candidate for analysis. And a person who can be a candidate for analysis, you judge that they have a structure which is sufficiently foursquare. I didn't say perfectly, sufficiently foursquare that they can stand an encounter with the unconscious, a conscious encounter with the unconscious. Do you know what I mean? Because when you first realize the reality of the unconscious, the objective psyche, when you realize that there really is a big thing in there besides you, if you're really loosely organized, you may get psychotic. So in other words, with everybody, I don't talk about this stuff I'm talking about today. I would not go there if I thought it would overstimulate, as the self-psychologists say, the personality. If they find out about it and they insist on approaching that, I will consider it carefully. But there are people who are clearly analytic, who have the capacity to go deeper and to deal consciously with the unconscious. And those people are analytical candidates, and they can go a lot further. Their cup can carry you can help them optimize a lot more, and you can carry them to the point that they are able to carry a lot of radiant energy without getting crazy. And that's what I think analysis should be about. Individuation, that should be optimization. And what's spirituality got to do now? You got on about analysis. What's spirituality and spiritual direction got to do? It's my responsibility to help that person realize that if they're really going to power up, they're going to need to create a very, very tailor-made spiritual discipline. If somebody is so secular they have no spiritual director in there because of who they are, they won't talk to one, which I deal with. I deal with some really, really doctrinaire atheists, very smart doctrinaire atheists, successful, smart doctrinaire atheists. And in that case, I will try to help them use Jungian techniques to have an existential spirituality in relationship to the great other. Because for them, they don't need to call it God. They don't need to call it they can call it the dragon. And they can get better. I do a lot of active imagination with that type of person. And they're freaked out by the fact that this big thing in them talks to them and it's not their ego. They're a little shocked that it's not their ego. But those people who have access to a tradition, I'll nudge them to draw upon the vessels and the symbolism of that tradition to help them regulate. If they're Roman Catholic, if they're Protestants even, I send Protestants to the Mass. And I explain the Mass like I've explained it to you. I say, forget all that theology stuff. This is what this is about. Go do it. And they do, and it makes them a lot saner when they do it. Think about it that way. So anyway, that's counseling, psychotherapy, analysis, and spiritual direction. I don't do spiritual direction with all the people that come see me. So many of them have good spiritual directors. I don't have to. I will if I have to. I'm trained to do that. So I will do that if I have to. Does that help you? So in other words, when I say I'm a Neo-Jungian behavioral therapist, I really mean it. When I say I'm a Neo-Jungian cognitive therapist, I really mean it. When I say I'm a Neo-Jungian systems therapist, I really mean it. And I think you can integrate these things at the conceptual level better than anybody's done. But also, I think as an integrative psychotherapist, you can integrate them at the clinical level. And it's not simply eclecticism. There's a reason you choose the interventions that you choose. Let's see how we're doing. We're out of time. Let me say thank you again for coming and giving me a chance to talk about this stuff and share it with a lot of people who will get access to it through these tapes. And I deeply appreciate that. And again, if you know of therapists that would be interested in studying with me, I'll put them on to that address in that brochure. And if you are interested in events that I do here or other places, you can check out my website at www.robertmoorephd.com. And again, thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you. Brandy,
Discover your true masculine power through the king, warrior, magician, and lover archetypes, energies that have defined strong men for millennia. In just 5 minutes, this free test reveals which of your masculine energies are in balance and which need work. The result? Clear direction for your personal development and masculine empowerment. Thousands of men have gained insights to reshape their lives. Why not you? Take the Masculine Energy Indicator test now at masculinetest.com.